It's finished. The console is built, the chips are designed, the games are written. The factories have been running for months. Everything is boxed, labeled, and ready to ship. It just isn't going anywhere. Somewhere in a warehouse in 1984, thousands of Atari 7800 ProSystem consoles are sitting in the dark, waiting. Not because anything is wrong with them, not because the technology failed or the games weren't good enough, but because two corporations are arguing over a check, and nobody can agree on who is supposed to sign it. Outside that warehouse, the world is moving. A company called Nintendo is quietly signing deals, locking up developers, securing licenses, building the walls of a market that will belong entirely to them by the time anyone thinks to look up from the argument. The 7800 was built by some of the most talented engineers in the industry. It was announced to genuine excitement. It was ready to change the console wars. It just needed someone to open the door. Join us as we tell the story of a right console at the wrong moment on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 297th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are looking back at the Atari 7800 ProSystem, the console that Atari built to reclaim its place in the living room, announced to genuine excitement in 1984, and then left sitting in a warehouse while two corporations argued over who owed whom a payment. By the time it reached store shelves in 1986, the world had moved on. The story of how that happened and what the 7800 was underneath all of those missed opportunities is one of the most fascinating what ifs in console history, and our topic for today. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who I absolutely have no doubt would have been first in line to buy an Atari 7800 in 1984, and who I strongly suspect still might actually hold a grudge against Jack Tramiel for reasons that are about to become very clear. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, let's be honest. When you heard the words Atari 7800, what's the first thing that came to mind?
Well, Dave, not a whole lot, because it wasn't a console I ever had any dealings with.
Do you know of it?
I know of it. That's the extent. I've never played it, never held one, never seen one in person outside of maybe a museum.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, 7800 never came. It's just not one of the ones that was involved in my video game growing up.
It coexisted with the Nintendo.
Well, yeah, and we had a Nintendo, but we didn't have a 7800. Only the 2600, I think it was.
We did have a 2600. But what?
Yeah, so never 7800, so never got to experience.
What Atari consoles are you familiar with?
2600. 2600. The 7800 I know of.
Any others?
Was the original that had, it was just the joystick. I don't know what it was called, but it was the original Atari.
The original is the 2600. It's the VCS.
Oh, I thought there was one before that was just a joystick with a button.
Oh, you mean the Pong thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wasn't that Atari?
Atari had a Pong machine. Everybody did.
And then anything newer than that, I just what we've talked about on the podcasts.
Wow, you missed the middle one. Nuts. That's okay. The 5200.
Yeah, something.
No, 52.
52. Oh,
there was a 2600, a 5200, and then a 7800. On the
Okay, thank you. The math is making sense now.
Well, does it? Why 52 then 78? We're going to learn that today.
Math.
We're going to learn that today, actually.
26 plus 26 is what, Dave?
52,
Plus 26 is what?
78. But that's not the reason. That's actually
Nope, that's the
no,
reason.
no, it's actually not the reason. But it makes sense. Like, it makes sense, but that's actually not the reason why they came up with it. The reason why they came up with it is really funny, actually. So, all right. Well, we're going to get into that and many other things today. So we have a lot to talk about. This is kind of a fascinating story. The Atari 7800 flopped. And so, a lot of people don't know of it or about it or its history or like anything much. So people are going to learn a lot today. Before we get to that story, though, there are always other happenings during each week in gaming history. So why don't you take a few moments and share with our listeners what else happened this week?
All right, kicking it off on May 5th, 1980, Mystery House was released for the Apple II by Roberta and Ken Williams, marking the release of the first graphic adventure game ever made. Roberta conceived the story, drew 70 scenes by hand, and Ken wrote the engine to display them, since no such software existed at the time. The game shipped in Ziploc bags through mail order for $24.95 and sold more than 10,000 copies in its first year, which for 1980 was a staggering number. It launched Online Systems, the company that would eventually become Sierra Online, and changed the course of adventure gaming forever. We actually told the story of Roberta Williams and her legacy back in episode 89 when we covered King's Quest. So to learn more, go check it out.
Yes, indeed, including
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about Sierra Online a bit too and all that,
we
and
had.
things they did.
Well, we talked about Roberta again when we did the episode on Phantasmagoria, which was her like full motion video extravaganza.
Yeah, that one. See, I knew we did. Next up, speaking of things that we have covered before, on May 5th, 1992, Wolfenstein 3D was released for PC by id Software, developed by John Carmack and John Romero, among others. Players took on the role of Allied spy BJ Blazkowicz, escaping from a Nazi prison, navigating maze-like corridors, and mowing down guards in what became one of the foundational titles of the first-person shooter genre. Fast, brutal, and controversial, it established many of the conventions that Doom and Quake would later build on. And we covered this back in depth back in episode 88, one just before King's Quest with Roberta Williams, go figure. So go listen to it there if you want to learn more. You can do 88, 89, boom, you just got two of them right back to back.
Back to back.
Indeed. Next up, on May 2003, EVE Online launched for PC, developed and published by the Icelandic studio CCP Games. One more C, and you may have thought them Russian. Set in a distant star system called New Eden, EVE Online offered players a vast player-driven universe where they could mine, trade, build corporations, wage war, and scheme against each other in real time on a single shared server. It became famous for the scale and consequence of its player interactions, including some of the largest and most expensive battles in gaming history. Over 2 decades later, it remains one of the longest running and most complex online games ever made. Indeed.
When they say expensive, they mean expensive because you can use real world money to purchase things in game. There's an economy where it's an equivalent, and people have literally lost thousands of dollars in warfare and like piracy because of it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean it's always crazy to me how that kind of stuff is real games, real money in games. I mean, like Second Life, I heard you could make a money in. Obviously, people spend money in game and WoW, and even RuneScape. Even though no RWT, there's still things when you buy a bond with cash and then you sell the bond for in-game gold, and then you buy things with gold. Effectively, you're spending money to buy items in games. So, it's everywhere now.
It's absolutely everywhere.
Indeed. And speaking of everywhere, for those of us that are racing fans, on May 3rd, 2005, Forza Motorsport was released for the original Xbox, developed by Turn 10 Studios and published by Microsoft. Built explicitly to challenge Sony's dominant Gran Turismo franchise, it arrived with over 200 cars, 17 track locations, and a physics engine that earned widespread praise for its accessibility and depth. Microsoft director Kiki Wolfkill was direct about the ambition at the time, saying the team was targeting Gran Turismo and had a lot of respect for it, which helped drive the desire to beat it. Forza Motorsport received a universal acclaim and launched one of Microsoft's most enduring franchises. And the new Forza Horizon, which would have spawned from Forza Motorsport, is set to be released soon. So, yeah.
I learned something interesting about Forza recently that I never knew before. I did it as one of my daily social media videos.
Oh, yeah?
They knew they wanted to beat Gran Turismo, right? That was the whole point of it, beat Gran Turismo. So they did all the work to do that. Fantastic physics engine and graphics engine, and basically made a phenomenal simulator. And then they played it and had people play it, and it wasn't fun in any way, shape, or form. And so, literally, to solve that problem, they hired a producer who had worked on a producer or consultant. I don't know which. They hired someone who worked on the Pokemon franchise, and then they started playing Animal Crossing, and I can't remember the other one, but essentially what they've learned was what made those games fun was the collection loop, the the collecting cars and playing for a purpose. And so they went from their idea of being a car simulator to being a car collecting game where racing was the way you acquired your next car.
Hmm.
So Forza Motorsports loop literally came from like Animal Crossing and Pokemon.
Yeah, I can understand that. And, hey, maybe we'll dive a little more in depth in it if we ever happen to touch on motorsport as a topic.
Yes, indeedy.
So if that's something people are interested in, post it on our website or our Discord. Information later on in the podcast.
Yes, indeed.
Last up for This Week in Gaming History, on May 8th, 2012, Starhawk was released for the PlayStation 3, developed by Lightbox Interactive in partnership with SCE Santa Monica Studio, and published by Sony. A spiritual successor to the multiplayer shooter Warhawk, Starhawk added a full single-player campaign and a distinctive build and battle system that allowed players to drop bunkers, walls, and other structures into the battlefield in real time, blending third-person shooting with real-time strategy in a way few games had attempted before. Fortnite before it was Fortnite. It earned strong praise for its multiplayer component, with some reviewers calling it among the best on the PS3, though it found a smaller audience than its ambitions deserved.
Yeah.
And with that, Dave, I believe it is time for us to talk about our topic of the day. So why don't you take it away and teach us something about that new Atari console?
The new Atari. You know what's funny? That comment is very relevant to today's topic too. So
Yeah, that's fair.
yep. Yep. As we all know, by 1983, Atari was a company in free fall, which was a shame because just 12 months earlier, it had been the most dominant force in all of home entertainment. For the first 9 months of 1982, Atari's parent company, which was Warner Communications, we know them as Warner Brothers now, they reported $2.9 billion, that's billion with a B, $2.9 billion in revenue. Atari, one of their divisions, contributed half of that revenue. One division of one company selling plastic cartridges for a machine that sat in the living room, generating billions of dollars in 1982. The name Atari meant video games at the time the way that Kleenex meant tissues. You didn't ask what system someone had, you asked how many Atari games they owned. Then 1983 happened, right? The video game crash. We've done an episode on it. If you want to deep dive into it, learn all about it. No, ET is not solely responsible for the crash. There are lots of reasons. Again, go check out the episode. The market that had seemed inexhaustible turned out not to be, right? Shelves flooded with low quality software, ET included, from companies that had rushed in to grab a piece of the boom. Consumer confidence in video games collapsed, retailers stopped ordering, warehouses filled up. It was a whole thing. By the end of 1983, Atari reported a total loss of $538 million. That's like a $2 billion swing in a year and a half.
Yeah, that's insane.
As a result, Warner's stock price fell from $60 a share to 20. The company that had defined an industry was suddenly being discussed in the past tense. But let's be fair, Atari's problems hadn't really started with the crash. There were other things going on. They had been building for years, and there were many other problems starting on the inside. We've discussed before that the programmers who built Atari's best games had really never been treated like the assets they were, right? Management refused to put their names in manuals, afraid that competitors might poach them. So they didn't get the credit they deserved. And as part of that process, too, bonuses were minimal, even when a game sold millions. So they weren't getting paid what they were deserved. When four developers whose titles had accounted for more than 60% of Atari's game sales asked for better compensation, they were turned down. Those four men left and they founded Activision. Another group did the same, rejected, left and founded Imagic. The people who knew the hardware best, the core of Atari's programming division, the people who understood what it could do and what the Atari 2600 could not do, the people who knew how to push the system to its limits, walked out of the door and set up shop as competitors. And Atari spent years trying to sue them into silence instead of figuring out how to keep them. By 1982, the company had also made a series of public stumbles that had started to erode the goodwill that it had spent years building. The home version of Pac-Man, for instance, it sold over 7 million copies, but it still managed to damage Atari's reputation because anyone who played it could see that it barely resembled the game that they had pumped quarters into at the arcade. It was notoriously bad port. And the 5200 Super System, released that same year, 1982, as the intended successor to the 2600, arrived with controllers that didn't self-center, a body so large that it needed its own shelf, and no ability to play any of the games that most of the people owned. It had no backwards compatibility. It sold about 1 million units before it was quietly discontinued, right? And as this is happening, there's competition out there. The Mattel Intellivision had been chipping away at Atari's dominance since 1980, running television commercials that put the two systems side by side and dared viewers to tell the difference. The ColecoVision arrived in 1982 and it set a new standard entirely. Its arcade ports actually looked like the arcade games. And lurking behind both of them, to be fair, was a different kind of threat altogether. You know, the Commodore 64, a computer that had arrived at a price point that made parents ask a reasonable question: why buy a toy when you can buy a whole computer? So by 1983, Atari needed a new console. It needed one that fixed everything that the 5200 had gotten wrong. Frankly, it needed backwards compatibility with the 2600's enormous library. You know, that there was a whole base of games out there that people already owned and would not be willing to give up. It needed graphics that could go to toe with new competitive systems like the ColecoVision. And it needed a development team that could actually deliver it because the eternal teams that might have built something great had mostly been driven out the door over the previous few years. So, for the first time in its history, Atari looked outside of itself for help. And the company it found was a small operation in a renovated factory building in Kendall Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, about as far from Sunnyvale, where Atari was located, as you could get and still be in the same industry. Now, the story of General Computer Corporation, or GCC, begins, as a lot of great stories do, with a problem that nobody else had bothered to solve. It was 1981, and two MIT students named Kevin Curran and Doug McRae were running a small side business managing arcade machines in their dormitory. Nice side hustle, huh?
Yeah, I would say so.
They had missile command cabinets, and those cabinets were popular. Too popular in a way. The players at MIT were getting good, and a game that was too easy to beat stopped earning quarters. Now, the industry as a whole had a solution for this. They were called enhancement kits. They were small hardware modifications that you could buy and install to make a game harder, faster, or maybe more unpredictable. And there were kits being advertised and sold by companies for Asteroids, for Galaxian, for Pac-Man even, but nobody made one for Missile Command. So Curran and McRae, who were after all seniors at one of the best engineering schools in the world, decided that they were going to build one for themselves. They called it Super Missile Attack. They started selling it in May of 1981 for about $295 a unit. They moved about 1,000 of them. That's roughly $250,000 in profit from a project that they started during spring break.
That's pretty damn good.
Mm-hmm. Which no doubt got Atari's attention, right? And Atari sued them for $15 million.
As Atari would.
As Atari would. What followed was one of the more lopsided legal battles that the industry had ever seen, at least on paper. On one side, right, you have the largest video game company in the world with a legal budget to match. On the other hand, you have a handful of recent, now they're college dropouts because they were so successful, operating out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. But Curran and McRae had two things working in their favor. First, they were genuinely talented engineers who kept modifying their kit every time a judge blocked a specific version, staying one step ahead of every injunction. And second, Atari had been paying attention to what else GCC was building. Because while the lawsuit was ongoing, GCC had been developing a second enhancement kit, this one for Pac-Man, which they called Crazy Otto. When they demonstrated it to Midway, the company that had licensed Pac-Man from Namco for the American market, which was Midway, didn't threaten to sue them. Instead, Midway bought the rights to it. Crazy Otto became Ms. Pac-Man, one of the best selling arcade games of all time. Atari saw this and dropped the lawsuit. They hired GCC instead. It turned out that what Atari had been trying to shut down was exactly the kind of operation it needed. GCC had a reputation for building things quickly and building them well. Two things that Atari's own internal teams were struggling with in 1981. The settlement between the companies gave GCC a contract to develop arcade games and cartridges for Atari, and over the next 2 years, they delivered. They built coin-op games including Food Fight and Quantum. They programmed the official 2600 ports of Ms. Pac-Man and Centipede. They wrote more than half of the launch cartridges for the Atari 5200. Steve Golson, one of the engineers at GCC, who is out on the internet speaking at length about the company's history, described the atmosphere there as something close to controlled chaos. He has a lot of a lot of really fascinating anecdotes about this period. He's given talks at the Portland Retro Game Expo. I saw it at MIT Talk. If you look up Steve Golson, you can find a lot of really great. He's a fantastic speaker. GCC was 150 people at their peak, working out of a renovated factory in Kendall Square, fueled by Coca Cola, and the genuine belief that they were building something that mattered. They had a fire pole in the office. They held meetings around it. They went home when the sun came up, if they even went home at all. By 1983, Atari trusted GCC enough to hand them the most important project the company had. Not a game, not a peripheral. The idea of another Atari console. And GCC characteristically got to work. Now, the project started with a name, the 3600. The logic was simple enough. The 2600 was what they were building on. This was going to be better. So, 3600.
I mean, makes sense.
Right. What GCC was inevitably tasked with building had to do several things at once. First of all, they wanted it to play every Atari 2600 game ever made right out of the box with no adapter. That was non negotiable. The 5200's failure to offer that had been one of its most damaging weaknesses, and nobody at Atari wanted to repeat that mistake. It had to have graphics powerful enough to compete in a market where competitors like the ColecoVision had raised the bar for what arcade ports were supposed to look like at home. It had to address the concerns of parents who thought that a home computer was a smarter purchase than a game console. It had to do all of this on a timeline that would have it ready for Christmas of 1984. Now, off the bat, the backwards compatibility problem turned out to have a pretty elegant, also simple solution. Rather than trying to make a new graphics system that was somehow also compatible with the old one, GCC chose to simply include the original 26 hardware on the board itself. The TIA chip, the Riot chip, the whole architecture. When a 2600 cartridge went in, the system ran in 2600 mode because it literally was a 2600. When a new cartridge went in, it switched to the 3600 mode. It was literally two consoles in one sharing a body. The new graphics chip was a different challenge entirely, and that became the heart of the project. GCC named it Maria after the coffee liqueur Tia Maria, chosen partly because it was a natural companion to the existing Tia chip, and partly because the team was apparently having a good time with naming conventions. The plan was that eventually the two chips would be combined into a single piece of silicon, and they already had a name in mind for the future chip, which was going to be Kahlua.
Nice. Good name.
Maria was genuinely ambitious, where the 2600's graphics systems had been built around player missile graphics, a framework that imposed strict limits on how many objects could be on screen and what they could look like. Maria worked very differently. It used a display list architecture borrowed from arcade machines, capable of moving somewhere between 75 and 100 objects on screen simultaneously without the flickering and slowdown that had plagued home ports of arcade games for the past few years. The 7800 version of Robotron, one of the most object heavy games ever designed at the time, ran with more than 70 enemies on screen at once. The 70
Damn.
Exactly. I mean, there are games nowadays that can't even do that.
Yeah, seriously.
The 7800 version of Joust rendered its mounted knight in 10 different colors. That's amazing. These were things that the 2600 and the 5200 simply could not do. Now, it all sounds great, but a Maria did not arrive fully formed. The first version of the chip, completed in July of 1983, turned out to have a critical flaw. It could put an extraordinary number of objects on the screen, but in doing so, it consumed nearly all of the CPU's available processing time. So when all was said and done, there was nothing left over to actually run a game. Golson later described the moment of realization with characteristic directness. He said that the chip could display everything, but couldn't move anything. So the team at GCC went back to the drawing board. Maria 2 followed with a revised architecture that solved the problem. Now, sound ended up being a harder problem, and ultimately it was a problem that never got fully solved, to be fair. Maria didn't have room for audio circuitry, which meant that the 3600 would need a separate sound chip. GCC actually went and designed one. They called it Mini, a scaled down version of a more ambitious chip called Gumby that had been planned for a different project. The naming logic here is consistent because Atari already had a chip called Pokey, so naturally GCC's chips were going to be the, other characters from the same world, Gumby and Mini. Mini was designed to go inside each cartridge rather than on the console motherboard, which would keep the console itself cheaper to manufacture while still giving developers access to quality audio. By the accounts of the people who built it, Mini was complete and ready to go. And beyond the chips, GCC kind of designed a whole ecosystem around the 3600. They designed a high score cartridge that used battery backed RAM to save scores for up to 65 different games, which is something no console had ever offered before, right? Because battery backed cartridges didn't come until the NES era, and we're still before that. A full keyboard peripheral would connect through a port on the 7800, right? So they could use a keyboard, and that would turn the console into something that could possibly run disk drives and printers. They could piggyback through it. So it basically, the way it worked is keyboard into 7800, and then the keyboard on Atari's 8-bit computer line had its own port that could continue to piggyback. So it was a daisy chain effect. And so they kind of use that as their way of saying, hey, we're an alternative to being a home computer, right? They built an expansion port aside from that on the side of the unit, intended for a connection for a Laserdisc player that they were going to build later on, because Laserdiscs were becoming a thing. They designed an authentication system built into the cartridge slot that would verify whether or not an inserted game was a genuine 3600 title or a 2600 cartridge, and switch modes accordingly. And that authentication system also gave Atari control over who could publish software for the system. By early 1984, the 3600 had been renamed the 7800 ProSystem. The reasoning, according to Golson, was that someone in there said, well, 7800 is close enough to twice 3600. And somehow that just made sense to everyone involved. I had to listen to that twice in his speeches. That was their logic. Well, it's somewhat twice 3600.
And this is after the 5200 was out.
Yeah. You're like,
And they literally couldn't.
your math makes sense, and that's probably the real a story, and that's just a nice funny joke line that they can use that was also said.
I sure hope so, because goddamn, man. People say we're smooth brain now. Come on.
1 million units were being planned for production in the first year. 3 to 4 million was the plan over the following few years after that. Atari was a sponsor of the 1984 Summer Olympics and intended to use that platform to push the 7800 aggressively into the market. On May 21st, 1984, Atari made the announcement official. The venue was the USS Intrepid, the aircraft carrier turned museum that is docked on the Hudson River in New York City. 13 launch titles were announced, and the press was very enthusiastic. Electronic Games magazine called the Maria chip's capabilities extraordinary and noted that the 7800's graphics were superior to any home computer on the market under $1,000. Everything was ready. The console was built, the games were written, the factories were running, and then, exactly 6 weeks later, everything stopped. On July 2nd, 1984, Warner Communications sold Atari's consumer division to Jack Tramiel. Now, Tramiel was not an unfamiliar name in the industry. He had founded Commodore International, built it into one of the dominant forces in home computing, and then left the company in early 1984 after a falling out with Commodore's board. He purchased Atari's consumer division from Warner for the assumption of its roughly $240 million in debt, merged it into his own company, Tramiel Technology Limited, and renamed it the Atari Corporation. His stated intention was to use Atari to compete directly against his former company. Computers for the masses, not for the classes, had been his motto at Commodore, and he was bringing that philosophy with him. Now, what happened next has been misrepresented for decades. The common version of this story for years was that Tramiel looked at the 7800, decided that video games were a dead market, shelved the whole project, and only changed his mind once the Nintendo Entertainment System proved that there was still money to be made. That's a tidy narrative. It's also not what happened. GCC's own Eternal newsletter from August 1984, just weeks after the sale, shows Tramiel actively discussing plans to increase 7800 production for the Christmas season and lower the launch price. He was not trying to kill the 7800. What stopped the launch was something far more mundane and far more damaging for being so. Nobody could agree on who owed GCC their money. GCC's development contract had been signed not with Atari directly, but with Warner Communications. When Tramiel purchased the consumer division, he believed that the outstanding payments to GCC should have been covered as part of the acquisition deal.
But did he verify?
Warner, it's a great question. Of course, Warner disagreed. They believed that the new Atari Corporation was responsible for said payments. And so the two sides argued back and forth for the better part of a year, while the Atari 7800 consoles that had already been manufactured sat in warehouses and the launch window closed around them.
Nice.
In May of 1985, Tramiel relented and paid GCC for the hardware development. That August, he paid for the 10 launch titles that GCC had developed. With the payment dispute finally resolved, Atari began looking for someone to lead a rebuilt internal console division. They found that person in Mike Katz, who came on board that September and immediately began working on relaunching the 7800 alongside the 2600 Junior. When Katz started shopping for arcade licenses to bring to the 7800, he ran into a wall he hadn't seen coming. The titles he wanted, the games players were actually lining up to play, were already gone. A company called Nintendo had been quietly signing third-party developers to strict licensing agreements that prevented them from releasing the same game on a competing platform for 2 years. By the time Katz went looking, Nintendo hadn't even finished its test launch of the NES yet, but the licenses were already locked up. That was the moment that Atari first understood what it was actually up against. You know, Rob, Hearing about the 7800's journey to store shelves, 2 years in a warehouse, a payment dispute that no one could resolve, a launch stripped of everything that made it special, all this chaos, it makes me genuinely grateful to know that starting a podcast doesn't require any of that.
Yeah, there's no corporate acquisition, no contracts with the wrong company, no sitting in a warehouse waiting for someone to write a check.
Exactly. And that's largely because I use Zencaster. It's an all in one podcasting platform that takes the chaos out of the process entirely. You just log in from your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There is no complicated setup, no payment disputes, and no 2 year delay.
And what about when things go wrong mid recording? Because they always do.
Well, that's where Zencaster's multi layered backups come in. Even if your connection drops, your recordings stay safe and the highest quality. No lost work, no starting over.
And editing? Don't tell me that it takes a year and a half.
Not even close. Zencaster's post production tools automatically clean up background noise, trim filler words, and balance your audio. The polish happens without the grind.
And when it's done, how do we get it out there? Don't say that I have to find someone to lead an entirely new division just for that.
Nah, it's just one click, man. Zencaster distributes your podcast directly to all the major platforms. There's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more, all from the same dashboard. All one place, record, refine, release.
So basically, the opposite of launching the Atari 7800.
Pretty much. If you're interested, listeners, go over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've got a story to tell, Zencaster makes sure the only thing sitting in a warehouse is your competition.
No payment dispute required.
Absolutely not. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code, all one word, and you can get 30% off your first month.
And now, with that, did the 7800 ever get back the launch that it deserved?
Well, the Atari 7800 ProSystem finally launched nationwide in May of 1986. 2 years late, to be fair, with a marketing budget of only $300,000. For context, Sega spent $9 million marketing the Master System that year, and Nintendo spent $16 million on the NES. Atari's entire promotional budget for the console it was counting on to reclaim its place in the market was less than 2% of what Nintendo was spending. The 7800 didn't get a second chance to make a first impression, it barely got a first chance. Now, the console itself was largely intact from what GCC had built in 1984. The Maria chip was there, the Sally CPU was there, the backwards compatibility with the 2600 was there, but almost everything else that had made the 7800 more than just a game console had been stripped away by this point. The keyboard expansion was canceled, the high score cartridge was canceled, the expansion port that was present on the earliest production units was quietly removed from later runs to save costs, and Mini, the sound chip that GCC had designed and completed, never made it into production. Now, that last decision had consequences that genuinely followed the 7800 for its entire commercial life. Because without Mini and without the Pokey chip that Atari's 8-bit computers had been using for years, the only thing the 7800 had for audio was the TIA chip from the Atari 2600. The same TIA chip that shipped with the Atari 2600 in 1977. 9 years of audio progress just set aside. And the result was a console that could put 100 objects on the screen simultaneously and render arcade quality graphics, but whose sound effects were indistinguishable from a machine that had come out when Star Wars was still in its first theatrical run. Now, there was a workaround. There were extra pins that GCC had added to the cartridge slot that allowed developers to actually include a Pokey chip inside the cartridge itself, giving individual games access to far better audio should they choose to take advantage of it. But only 2 games in the entire 7800 library took advantage of this. Two, Ballblazer and Commando, both which arrived late in the console's life, and also neither of them actually using the chip to anything close to its full potential. The rest of the library made do with what the TIA chip could offer, and that wasn't much. The launch library told its own story. 8 games were available in May of 1986: Asteroids, Centipede, Dig Dug, Food Fight, Joust, Ms. Pac Man, Pole Position 2, and Robotron 2084. By all means, these were all excellent ports. The Maria chip did exactly what GCC had designed it to do, and the arcade conversions were sharper and more faithful than anything the 2600 or 5200 could have managed. But every one of those games was between 3 and 6 years old at launch. Can you imagine that in this day and age?
No, I don't think I can.
I can't either. That gets me, man. A brand new console, the Xbox Series Quadruple X comes out, right? And they can't do anything but give you games that remakes. The whole launch library are remakes of games that came out 6 years ago. Like,
Yeah,
like
the Switch 2 is about the closest thing I could even consider, but even that, it's not even a good comparison because, they actually made their own games and they're better.
it kind of is though. I mean, it didn't have a big launch library either, did it?
I mean, it had its own games, and it definitely improved upon games that were already out there.
This did too, to be fair. Actually, I think that's a decent comparison.
Oh, I guess I didn't get a Switch 2, but I don't really use my Switch 1, so
Yeah,
I don't know. I can't really speak to that. But I feel like there was some stuff that's exclusive. I mean, I definitely know there are exclusives to the Switch 2, so kind of, but close enough.
sure enough.
I guess I can't think of it. Shame on me. I lied.
So in May, we had these 8 games. Galaga arrived in August. Xevious arrived in November. By the end of 1986, the 7800 only had 10 games in its library. Nintendo comparatively had 36. 9 of them were from third-party developers. The 7800 had none from third parties. And that reason went back to what Mike Katz had discovered that previous year, right? Nintendo's licensing agreements didn't just lock up the individual titles, they locked up the developers themselves. Any company that signed with Nintendo agreed to not release the same game on a competing platform for 2 years. With NES already dominating the market, developers signed with Nintendo first and worried about everyone else later. So the 7800 and, to be fair, the Sega Master System were both fighting over whatever was left, which was, rarely the game that anyone wanted to play. By the end of 1986, the 7800 had only sold 100,000 units in the United States. The Master System had sold 125,000. The NES had now sold 1.1 million units. The earliest production units of the 7800 had been manufactured in 1984, before the sale to Trammell, before the payment dispute, before any of it, right? They had sat in warehouses for 2 years waiting for a launch that kept not happening. And when they finally reached the store shelves in 1986, some of those original units still carried the expansion port on their left side. A physical reminder of everything the 7800 had been designed to be and wasn't anymore. It was a door that opened onto nothing, right? Now, the story of the Atari 7800 is often told as a simple failure, and the numbers make it real easy to tell it that way. Nintendo controlled 80% of the North American market by the time the 7800 was discontinued on January 1st, 1992. Atari comparatively only controlled 12%. The console that was supposed to restore Atari's dominance ended its run as a distant third in a 3-horse race. But the full picture is more complicated than that and perhaps more interesting. The 7800 sold 3.77 million units over its lifetime. It was, by Atari's own accounting, a profitable enterprise, kept afloat largely by low investment in development and marketing, and by the enduring appeal of the backwards compatibility with the 2600. When the console finally reached the UK in 1989, Computer and Video Games magazine noted that in the United States, it had been outselling the Sega Master System at the time, and it was positioned as a budget friendly alternative worth considering. It was never the juggernaut Atari had hoped for and frankly needed, but it was not nothing. And towards the end of its life, something interesting started to happen with the software. The early library had been shaped almost entirely by what GCC had built in 1984 and all those, non-existent arcade licenses that Atari could actually secure around the lockout. And that meant a lot of ports of games from 1980 to 1983. They were phenomenal ports, but hardly exciting to a kid standing in a toy store in 1987, looking at a wall that also had, Super Mario Brothers and The Legend of Zelda on it. The 7800 just couldn't compete on that level, and everybody knew it. But later on in its life, developers began to figure out what the hardware could do, when someone actually took the time to learn it. So there are fantastic games on it. Midnight Mutants was a sprawling action RPG with a hint system and more areas to explore than most players ever found. It featured an unofficial likeness of Al Lewis from the Munsters that Atari apparently used without ever securing the rights or actually getting sued for it. Alien Brigade was a first person shooter inspired by the arcade game Operation Wolf, with cutscenes and combat mechanics that show genuine ambition. Ninja Golf combined a golf game with a side scrolling brawler in a way that had no right to work, but absolutely did. Basket Brawl, exactly what it sounds like. These were strange, original games, and they are better than the console's reputation suggests. The hardware itself was capable of more than its library demonstrated. The technical comparison with the NES is really nuanced. Maria could put more objects on the screen than the NES's graphics chip, and so in pure sprite count, the 7800 had a real advantage. But the problem was the cost of that advantage. Maria's graphics architecture required significant computer time to maintain, which meant that while the 7800 could display more, it had less processing power left over for, the game logic and artificial intelligence and pretty much everything else that makes a game feel alive. So the NES's more rigid, fixed function graphics chip left its computer itself free to do other work. So Nintendo had chosen simplicity and gained more flexibility because of it. GCC had built something more powerful in paper and ended up with something harder to use in practice. And of course, as we know, the sound gap was real and never closed. Only 2 games of the Pokey chip against a total library ended up only being 59 games. That's not a footnote, right? That's a structural failure that colored every single review, every comparison, every moment when a player picked up a 7800 controller and then heard the sound of the 2600 system coming out of it. And yet, Rob, you said new 7800.
The homebrew. I just said new Atari, to be fair. I didn't say new 7800.
There is a homebrew community that grew up around the 7800. The community gained its wings in the 2000s, and that tells a very different story about what the hardware was capable of. There are programmers who came to the console decades after its commercial death, with no deadlines or Jack Tramiel watching the budget, and they figured out techniques that the original developers never had time to explore. Because of them, the Atari 7800 library has nearly tripled in size through their work. Some of the homebrew titles look, by the accounts of the people who grew up with the system, like nothing the official library has ever managed. They found the ceiling, and it was higher than anyone in the 80s had ever found or even thought. And that's kind of the 7800's legacy in miniature, right? It was a console that was genuinely capable, built by people who knew what they were doing, caught between two corporations arguing over a check, launched into a market that had already made up its mind and never given the time or the resources to show what it could have been. The games that finally proved what the hardware could do arrived too late, or honestly, there's a bunch of canceled games. Lots of them never arrived at all. We there are prototypes of Clax and Toki and other games that have been found by collectors over the years. They're dumped and available online. Many finished games that never shipped, more doors opening onto nothing. When Atari formally ended production on January 1st, 1992, it discontinued the 7800, the 2600, and the entire 8-bit computer line in a single announcement. The console that had been built to save Atari went out the same way it had spent most of its life: quietly, without ceremony, and well behind schedule. If today's episode sent you deeper into the world of Atari, we've got plenty of ground already covered that connects directly to this story. Episode 210 tells the full story of the Atari 2600, the console that the 7800 was built to succeed and to carry forward. If you want to understand just how much was riding on the 7800 to get it right, that's the place to start. Atari 274 covers the Atari Jaguar, the console that came after, and tells the story of what happened when Atari tried one more time to reclaim all this market share it lost here. And then, if you want to hear another interesting story from their history, episode 127 covers the Sword Quest series. Another Atari story that Jack Trammell's acquisition brought to an abrupt end, with prizes worth tens of thousands of dollars promised to players who would never ever get to claim them. Between those three episodes and today's, you get a pretty good idea of what Atari was, what it could have been, and what kept getting in the way. You can find those episodes and everything else in our archive found at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find when they head to our website?
Well, Dave, people can find the calendar that shows our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in coming weeks. They can find a link to our Discord where they can come chat with I, maybe discuss episode topics that we might cover in the future, give some suggestions, or just other gaming related topics. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I can be found on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've even covered a few places as well. We're telling you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's this fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning. And in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
I think my biggest takeaway today, Dave, actually came right at the end. It's the fact that the homebrew community has made the library so much bigger. It's just kind of cool to me to think that there's people who enjoyed this console so much that they took the time to learn how to develop games for it and then did. It's not like we hear about indie gamers now and they make for just generic PC or whatever. But for someone to take a console that's that old and still make games for it and like be that committed, it's kind of cool. And it's also really cool to see what could have been capable if the whole who's going to pay for the thing didn't really happen and they were able to, push the technology and see what they could do with it. So I just think it's really cool.
I agree. There are homebrew communities are amazing. People that are still developing games for these systems. They're still developing games for Atari 2600. They're still developing new NES games. There are companies that do limited prints of that you can still buy new retail NES games. Like there are companies out there that do limited runs of these brand new games, like actual new cartridges in the year 2026. I think what's so fun for a lot of people about these old systems is the simplicity of them, because it took genuinely good programming to make these games, right? There were no engines. There were no YouTube guys, tricks of the trade. These old languages, programming languages like assembly and basic and what have you. Like you have to be good and direct at what you do. And I think that these homebrew guys really enjoy that, in my opinion. So I agree. I think it's cool what they do nowadays.
Fair enough. So that's it for my takeaway. What about yourself, Dave?
I'll be honest, I also did not know much about the 7800. I know it existed, right? I mean, I've seen them. I think I have I know I have one, to be fair. I don't think I've ever played it. It's just something I bought and put in a box somewhere.
Fair
But
enough.
I'm
I
a
mean, hey, you should pull it out and give it a try.
Yeah, I mean, I have systems that I bought for the sake of owning them. They're cool to have. It's like when you're into the history, you like historical artifacts, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
Um,
Not for playing, just for showing.
I never knew much about it. This whole story is new to me. Why they designed it, what it was. I couldn't have even told you that the sound is the same as the 2600. That kind of blows my mind. I wrote the line 9 years of audio progress just set aside. Like that blows my mind that someone was like, okay, this is good, right? Like we're building this brand new system that is cutting edge, right? We want it to be the greatest and latest thing, and we're gonna keep the sound chip from the Atari 2600. I I still can't wrap my head around that in any way, shape, or form. Just I just can't do it. I can't do it.
I mean, hey, it was cheaper that way, you know?
It was, but it just like and maybe it was where the market was, right? Because nowadays we understand how important sound design is. And in an industry that was just starting to come out of its shell past the beeps and the boops, right? Maybe didn't yet understand the importance of that. And in this case, I think it definitely soured the experience for a lot of people. I can't imagine that. Can you imagine if they did that with the Nintendo that came out at the Nintendo and the it sounded like the Atari 2600? Like there's some great music from the NES era that we still love to this day. Yeah, we now have more fancier versions of it, but like what would the Mario theme song sound like on the TIA chip, for instance? What would the Legend of Zelda theme song sound like on the TIA chip? Like I just think about all these great games that sound contributed to that, and I can't even fathom what it would be like if they had used sound from the 1970s. It just, I don't know, blows my mind.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. You're right. I couldn't honestly imagine anything like that. And this isn't a situation like earlier where I said I can't, but I can.
All right, Rob. Well, before I wrap up this episode and take it into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us, and we hope that you enjoy getting to learn a little bit about the things that we talk about.
Indeed. Thank you so much. The Atari 7800 was ready in 1984. The chips were designed, the games were written, the factories had been running for months. GCC had built something genuinely capable, something that could probably have changed the conversation about what a home console was supposed to be. And then two corporations started arguing over a check. It's tempting to blame Jack Tramiel for what happened next. He has carried that reputation for decades. But the fuller picture is more complicated. Tramiel wanted to sell the 7800. He wanted to lower the price and move units for Christmas of 1984. What stopped him wasn't indifference, it was greed, right? It was a contractual dispute that neither side would budge on, and a launch window that kept shrinking while they argued. By the time that argument was settled, Nintendo had already built the walls of a market that would belong to them for an entire generation. The 7800 is a console that deserved better from everyone involved. From Warner, who structured a contract that would become a weapon in a corporate dispute. From Trammell, who stripped it of everything that made it more than a game machine. From Atari, who launched it with the enthusiasm of a company that had already given up. And perhaps most of all, from its timing, which is the one thing it couldn't control most of all. Steve Golson and the team at GCC built something worth remembering. The homebrew developers still building games for the 7800 today clearly agree. And it goes to show you that some hardware is too good to stay forgotten. Next week, we are trading the console wars for something a little darker. In 2010, a small Finnish studio called Remedy Entertainment released a game about a thriller writer who travels to a small Pacific Northwest town, loses his wife under mysterious circumstances, and finds himself hunted through the dark by something he can't explain, while pages of a manuscript he has no memory of keep turning up to predict everything that happens next. Alan Wake was unlike almost anything else on the market at the time. Part psychological thriller, part love letter to Twin Peaks and Stephen King, part meditation on the relationship between a writer and his own work. But before we get to the game, we need to talk about the studio that built it and a long, complicated road that led Remedy from Max Payne to the woods of Bright Falls. So join us as we step into the dark and write a manuscript on next week's trip down memory card lane to the thing.
Skibidi-dum-dap-bap-bam-boo-up-doo-ow.